was the tasting part. 'Cause we haven't done that. You know, it usually gets towards the end and I'm like 10 after, oh yeah, it's time to go. Here, let's eat this chocolate really fast. So today we have, so thinking about this, connecting the way people make things, like their habits, and then also this idea that I want to introduce today of terroir, and I'll have it's a French word. I'll have a slide that explains it a little bit more. But we can get a sense of this just through, these are two Peruvian in the book. 67% and 70%. So one is Patrick and one is French Broad chocolates. Yeah, French Broad. You know why it's called that?
The French Broad.
It conjures all sorts of ideas, right? But it's actually the name of a river in North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. It's a tributary of the the Tennessee River, but it flows on that side. So the French Broad, yeah, and try to keep them. I think the French Broad is a little darker and thicker, huh? Yeah, that's a little, okay. That's a little bit darker. So we'll let that go around. And so, two different chocolate makers. They're getting their chocolates. This is cacao from Peru, and pretty close to the same percentage level. So you'll be able to really contrast the differences, and so this time I want you all to sniff it first, taste it, let it settle, think about and I want you to respond with the different flavors that you get as it melts. And then we'll have a little bit of a minute or so, and then try the other one. Okay, how are we doing? They're sort of little pieces too. Yeah, don't spill it. That'd be sad. So while this is going around, let's have a conversation about foods that you think are really associated with a particular group of people or a particular place. Iconic. What can you think of? Yeah.
Popcorn at the movies.
Popcorn at the movies, yeah. Iconic, absolutely, of that place. And so even when you're at home and you're watching a family movie, you might, yeah, exactly. Gives you the full experience. What else? Like if I say Southern food, what comes to mind?
Fried everything. Some gumbo, fried Twinkies.
Fried Twinkies. And Twinkies, yes, Twinkies are made in the South, so. But yeah, the frying. So there is a great example, not of necessarily a particular food, but a way of making, the method of cooking. What else? What's a Midwestern food? What's an Illinois food?
Horseshoes.
Horseshoes?
Oh, yeah. So they're cooked.
Horseshoes.
Wait, horseshoes are Midwestern?
What are they?
Like you just put cheese all over.
It's basically like you put a hamburger with French fries and then smother the whole thing in nacho cheese.
Texas toast
It's
fries.
Wow.
It's phenomenal.
Where do you?
literally
Why have I not? I've been here 8 years and I've not heard of this. Where? In Springfield. Oh, they're famous for that. So again, Texas toast on the bottom, hamburger.
You can get like most places. Like I usually get bacon on
Oh.
And then like fries, they put
And then fries on it. And then the cheese on top of everything.
It's like covered, she's like
Entirely covered in cheese. So that I think of as a Midwestern thing, you know, the cheesiness and certain.
Breakfast ones for the gravy and hash browns.
Uh-huh.
Biscuits and English ones.
Uh-huh. And an egg, like a fried egg in there. Horseshoes, yeah, I have it. Okay, it's blowing my mind a little bit. What else? What's another thing from, huh?
Deep dish.
Deep dish pizza, yeah, yeah.
Chicago one.
A couple of people are working on pizza. One Giordano's advocate in particular. Yeah, so again, the cheese. Cheese is a thing, right? And why do you think cheese is a thing around here?
Neighbors with Wisconsin.
Yeah, you know, so Wisconsin's part is the upper Midwest, and there's just sort of that's part of the cuisine, definitely. And you have other cheese making. Has anybody here been to Rot Farm? Yeah.
so much fun. You get to pet all the cows.
I know, it's very sweet. They're all Jersey cows. So that's a great example too, because they pride themselves on having, not just that the cows graze on the grass around there, and that they milk them there, and that they, you know, do everything, every step of the cheese making, but that they're Jersey cows too, right? I hope that's still true. It was a few years ago. You know, like they've had this one lineage that they've bred, and so it's a great example of that. It's not just the grass that they're eating, but it's the kind of cow that they are. So did we end up with enough samples to go all the way around? Okay, good. Okay, so let's start out. Let me remind
Use
myself.
this as a crayon.
This is the, let's start out with the French broad, the thicker, darker one, because that's 70%. And tell me what you taste. First of all, sniff it, yeah.
Oh, too late for that.
I just popped it in my mouth. I don't really sniff foods, I just do.
No, just don't get to the O one yet. So what flavors are you getting?
It's very good.
It's bitter, but it has like a sweet aftertaste kind of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Almost like a berry chocolate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely that sort of tartness, a little bit of. Isn't that interesting?
Bittersweet.
It's bitter, yeah. Yeah. They're a company who actually works very intensively with the cacao growers, and so if you ever go to Asheville, North Carolina, they have a shop there. They have the best ice cream. Like they make a chocolate ice cream with their chocolate. Oh my gosh, it's so good. And all these other sorts of pastries and bonbons and things. But to make their chocolate, they, instead of, so you see the word fair trade, and we can think about that, more. But they do direct trade. So they personally know who they're working with. They've been on the farms. They've seen the trees. They've worked with those growers about ways to improve all those steps that y'all learned about, right? The fermentation, the drying, those kind of environments. And then those growers get to taste exactly what's being produced. They get to know what it is. Okay. Any other comments?
Yeah. Is there a label for direct trade?
No.
First time I've ever heard that.
No. So that's part of this movement that's happening in lots of different foods, because fair trade is such a large, ambiguous term that can mean lots of different things, and fairness isn't necessarily what results from it. But it is a feel-good label. Yeah, my coffee's better. It's got to be better, right? Direct trade's something where that there's that personal connection. And again, it's judging the quality of those social relationships. Direct trade doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better either, unless they're, you know, this is part of a bigger program within French Broad to create better, more equitable relationships. So, you know, so they really, and they have like other ways that you can find out about exactly what they're doing. So you get to judge for yourself. Okay, so that one, almost like I'm getting like at the very end, like the taste in your mouth afterwards is more like coffee than chocolate in some ways. Very interesting. So a lot of, so here's that sort of these, now, if you eat it like a candy bar, you're not necessarily thinking, so it's this, when we talk about slow savoring, I'm going to talk, I talked a little bit about it in sort of some Chinese experience of what good eating is, and so this is that sort of slower approach to things. Okay, let's try the Patrick bar. So this has a little bit more, yeah, sniff it first. What scents do you smell?
Well, I have nothing to compare it to now.
Here. That's the other one, yeah. So sniff it. Yeah. Okay. All right, taste it. And think about the texture.
The other one almost smells darker, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would say it has like that chocolate consistency.
Mhm.
It's definitely more bitter than French fries, I would say.
More bitter?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Diamond.
I might like this one a little better.
Mm-hmm.
And it like has like a weird like addition to the taste, but I literally cannot place
You
it.
can't place it. Anybody have other ideas about? Does it? Do you think it tastes a whole lot like the other one, or quite a bit different?
Yeah, kind of a faint sour to it.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of get sherry, I guess. You could say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just got a softer, like one part of cherry.
Yeah. So that's partly the sugar, and you can the additional sugar, but also you can think about differences in the amount of conching and the tempering and all of that went on, and the amount of cocoa butter that might be in there. I think, I get this sort of like herbal aromatic, almost like basil or something like that. That the weirdness is like this other.
Yeah, it's like something that I definitely wouldn't put in chocolate.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I'm bad.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Over the weekend, so my mom went to Napa and she got these chocolates from Napa and she had, like, my sisters and I taste test them or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And she had a little booklet and some of them were just like, they had fennel in them, they had like lavender in them.
Uh-huh.
The lavender one was gross.
Yeah.
Like really gross.
Yeah.
But they had just a bunch of different
Of additions into the
Mhm.
chocolate, yeah. Fennel would be interesting. And you'll see some, so I'm giving you just the pure bars without anything added, so you can taste those differences. And then these same makers also do ones with different kinds of inclusions, and they base it on, well, okay, we've got this batch, and here's this interesting note, and then let's put some cinnamon or some, lavender, or lavender ends up being really popular for whatever reason.
My mom really liked it and she really hated the fennel and the fennel tasted fine to me. But like the lavender was just like way too overpowering.
Yeah.
It was like cedar.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. So what we're doing, Diamond, here's, we tasted this one first, and these are both from Peru, and then this one, if you want. All right. So, different manufacturers, same cacao, similar cacao. I can't guarantee that it's from the same farm, but And so I would say there's this kind of tart fruitiness that you get in both of them, but still they're quite, fairly distinct tasting. Let's move on with this. I'm going to go through a couple of examples that I know about of this idea, a broader idea in different parts of Latin America. Well, actually, a Latin American example, then a European example, and then the one from our readings, the cooking technology one, the Costa Rica example that's in here, which was the assignment for today. So we can compare and contrast those, and we'll work on this idea of terroir and the way that politics can kind of creep into some of these elements and ideas of slow foods, savored foods, because we talked about fast foods a little bit last time. So, have any of y'all been to Belize? Highly recommend that too. I actually only been near Belize, not in Belize. I know a lot of people who live there. And so here's Belize in a map of North America, part of South America. So it's kind of stuck there on the side of the Caribbean, on the edge of the peninsula, the Mexican peninsula here. And that's Guatemala next to it. And for a while it was a Spanish colony. But then the British move in there, and it becomes a British colony. So you have this little country that's in the midst of all of this kind of struggles for independence in Latin America and so forth. And Belize stays a colony for a long time. So here, limited self-government, 1982. When were most of y'all born? Oh my gosh. Huh? Yeah. And there's an earlier shift. So there's like the first move towards political independence is changing from British Honduras. So Honduras, Spanish Honduras is right here, from British Honduras to Belize, which is more of the local name. And then limited self-government in 82, and then independence in the 90s. So very recent, right? So it's a great sort of recent example. And looking at the place of food within that sort of national identity. So, I was asking about Midwestern foods, Southern foods, that sort of thing. Well, what happens when you move from colonialism into an independent nation? Does it affect foods and the way they're seen? There's some, Richard Welk is the one he's an anthropologist who does a lot of food studies, and he's the one who worked on this material. And first of all, you should know about Belize. It's a teeny little country, right? But very, very diverse in its population. And in fact, these figures are maybe 6 or 8 years old, but it hasn't changed dramatically. Like the proportions are still pretty consistent. So 200,000 population in Belize. What's the population around here in Bloomington normal?
75. Well, I would double that. 150,000.
Yeah. So not a whole lot more, and that's a whole population of this country. So that gives you a sense of scale, right? And within that, quite a lot of ethnic variability, and the indigenous population in that region were Maya for the most part. And then you have all sorts of, because of different events over the colonial period, the Spanish descendants, people from other areas in Central America, these Asian, some of them were coerced labor, some were indentured labor, came in, Chinese, East Indians, and then these Garifuna, who are Afro-Caribs, especially live along the coast. And then you have a really high population living in the U.S. too. And so what do 200,000, and these are sort of older figures, I'm sure it's gone up, the tourism there, a couple 100,000 people a year, oh my gosh. And what are they doing? What's attractive? What have you heard? So for people who have heard of Belize before, what do you imagine? What do you imagine the place to be like? What are you expecting? What would be the lure? What do you think Belize is like? Huh? Yeah. Maya jungle, sort of this pristine, not so developed in many ways, exotic, right? And so this emphasis, and you see the same thing in the Costa Rica example, this sort of, well, we want to enjoy this exoticism, we want to see this, kind of in some ways quaint folk culture that's around there. And then the ancient ruins. There are definitely lots and lots of Maya sites there, ancient Maya sites. And then the other thing that the Belizean government, especially across the 20th century, quite developed. It wasn't a place of sort of Latin American industrial development, even for like big agribusiness. Like this wasn't a big banana producer, never was a great big sugar producer. Like they just sort of didn't end up getting involved in a lot of that kind of industry that's more typical in other parts of Latin America. And so what it means is that a lot of it is actually in pretty good shape environmentally speaking. And so they've developed tourism to appreciate that wild jungle and like this, I mean, beautiful, pristine Caribbean waters, you can go snorkeling, this is floating through a cave, a natural cave. And, so a lot of those sorts of attractions. So you have people going there and interacting, tourists coming in. What was it like under colonialism? So this is up into the 90s. If you're, and it's a British, like imagine that it's a little bit like England again. You're this British island, and then you're surrounded by all this other, and you want to keep yourself distinct. So how do you do that? One way was through food, absolutely. And there was an emphasis and a real value of how do you get British food here? It's like imported, tinned food became the high value, high status food. Things that were imported, like the best brands, came from the UK. And that resulted in, so if these exotic imported foods, because they're British, are highly valued by elites, what do you think that means about them? What else does that imply? Let's think about it. Does it mean everybody can get it? And why not? What would be some of the limiting factors? Yeah. Expensive, right. It's expensive to ship food across the Atlantic. Always was, always has been, and will continue to be for many ways. Have you seen, like at Meijer, they have the little British food section. You go to there's the row, and the aisle in Meyer, and they have all the different like regional sort of ethnic foods, and there's a little section that they have really weird things like canned clotted cream. I don't know, sounds bad. Anyway, very expensive though. And so who's controlling that and who's deciding the distribution of it? Well, it's these elites who own the businesses and own the distribution networks and so forth, and who are making the political decisions about that. So it's very strong sort of control over that part that was valued. And then what is the flip side of that? What do you think local foods are? How they're seen? Like local, regular, everyday foods grown in Belize.
Probably everywhere, really cheap.
Yeah, cheap food. And I'll show you some examples about class distinctions. One great example, and this is still under colonialism. A local food. This is the Caribbean. You can get lobster. You can get fish. And we would think, oh, lobster, wow, that should be really, no, that was seen as like trash food. It's so cheap and so common, and everybody can get it, and it's like picking up garbage off the street. So it was really rejected, and the main way that Richard Wolff observed people consuming that sort of thing, if they were middle class or even upper class, is if it's sort of dressed up like in European creamy sauce or special preparation methods that would make it acceptable. And that the kind of exotic food that was seen as sort of okay to eat, socially acceptable, would be what they called Spanish food, which would be Latin American seasonings and preparations. That was, even though they were sort of local products, that was seen as okay. And then there was also this other class of food that Wilk observed that was like guilty pleasures, but that no one would really talk about, and they certainly wouldn't serve to guests, but there were things that the people would eat themselves at home, but wouldn't admit to it. So one of them was these palm hearts, which is, again, like a cheap local food in this part of the tropics. Would be expensive here, right? Do y'all know, do you have any experience with a food like that? In your family or with friends, like stuff that they'd eat that they wouldn't admit to, and they certainly wouldn't serve it? No? There's, my parents-in-law were from the southeast, and there's this plant that grows in the springtime called creasy greens. And I almost thought they were mythical because my husband would talk about them. I would never, you'd see, we'd get there to visit, and there'd be the plates that you'd have little bits of them on there, and oh yeah, they must have had creasy greens. And it was that sort of thing that they gathered themselves, they ate, they wouldn't really admit to it, and they certainly didn't share it because they loved them so much, partly. And in El Salvador, there was also this other thing that was sort of like an asparagus. It was a chufle, and you had to harvest them wild. And and for Cherokees in the southeast too, there's a bracket fungus, and so it's like a mushroom called ishi, and that is definitely a guilty pleasure in Cherokee foodways. But you don't get it commercially. It's a local thing. And in fact, there's this great story of some friends who were driving in some area near Asheville, and they saw a bunch of ishi in this person's yard. And they went up and they said, well, we're from University of North Carolina, and we're doing an environmental study, and is it okay if we go collect some specimens that are in your backyard? And so the people were like, yeah, sure. And they went and they got the ishi, and then they took it home and ate it. Anyway, so these sort of country, I think of them as country foods. He talked about them that way. That's how they were talked about in Belize too, as these sort of things that you wouldn't totally admit to. Certainly not upper class. And then he talked about this dining experience he had in Belize. And this again was before political independence. And he was doing some ethnographic work, and this family, the situation came up where it was basically tea time, and he was there, and they were like, oh my God, we've got to feed this guy. We've got to give him something respectable. And so again, within the values of the different foods, what did they do? They scrambled to go buy some food for him. And he wasn't demanding it. This was just like their demonstration of hospitality, that they had to provide something to the family. So what did they go? They got all these different imported things. And so they bought the white bread. This is Mexican made, packaged white bread. Some sardines, some tinned sardines, again, because those are imported. Some corned beef, and then he describes it as like a warm Sprite that, and they had already eaten their substantial meal of the day, because by that point the sort of late afternoon tea time was really, like the main meal time for them. They had already done that. And so they're scrambling and getting all this stuff for him. None of which is a food, these are not like his favorite foods. This is just imagined, this is what this foreigner needs to have, this American who's visiting us. And what did he do? Eating. That's right. Ate food. Oh my gosh. Because there's no choice about it. And then, thanks for the generosity, which was true. And so all of this is expensive. It's this idea of this was luxurious food to give. Then what happens, what are different ways that you can reject colonial power? And in this Belizean example, you start to have, again with those, the name change of the country from British Honduras to Belize, there's also trends, political trends in food, where they're starting to try to promote local foods, and those as being emblematic of this Belizean identity. And there are these two kinds of local fish. Poopsie is one, and krana is the other. They put poopsie, no, this is krana, excuse me, on even on a stamp for the, for mail. And there were some political activists who were really trying to promote this, failed miserably, because it was just, again, this idea, and this is still under that political system that was, that the change had been made in the foodways, that there wasn't enough valuing of those local foods. And those particular examples were seen as like, I don't want to eat that. That's gross. And because, and this was the key point, a lot of it was far too identified as being a food of poverty, those particular fishes. And so to eat that meant you were, like debasing yourself, and you're making, these activisms are seen as impoverishing the whole country, making our diet worse. So that didn't go over so well. But then, with independence, and actually it's 84 is independence, and then the Queen comes to visit in 1985. It's the first time that the British Queen came to visit what had been the colony. And by that point, with actual political independence, there was this valuing of methods of cooking and in particular elements of cooking. And one of them was this thing called the gibnut, agouti. And so it's this jungle mammal. And there's one fixed up. It's not as dramatic as the, I couldn't find one with it splayed out in pieces like the guinea pig in the Peruvian case. But anyway, they thought, well, the idea was to serve the queen something that was real Belizean food, that authenticity. They served her gibnut. And what do you think the British reaction was across the Atlantic? They served the queen rat. Those awful ex-colonists, they showed their disdain for our amazing queen. Well, she ate it. It's a little bit like Richard Wolff. She ate it. She tried it. The queen did not complain. There was no voicing of disdain by the queen. She ate the food, seemed happy enough with it. It was all of the British, general reaction was of horror. And then, of course, the Belizean reaction is you're being really incredibly, you're devaluing these things that are core to us and are exemplary of us, and you just can't, see beyond your racism, that sort of thing. So, there was quite a acrid exchange about this food and this meal. And then in the same context, this post-colonial context, he goes for a meal again with a family. And about the same time of day. But what he's seen is that the whole, there's been this huge shift economically where it's much more of like a industrially driven day, work day, where you have smaller meals and then you have your dinner that's more formal and organized. Whereas with the Lambies, their big meal was earlier in the day. And what was there? Well, there was a celebration of certain Belizean kinds of stews and ingredients as like the main course. But then you also have, an elaborate place setting, all these sorts of displays of sophistication that go along with it. And I loved it. Of course, the dessert was chocolate. But they're imported chocolates. Imported drinks, wine for the meal, cocktails beforehand, and all of these things that are sort of this example of what he saw as taking these foreign elements and making them seem local, even though they're not, made in Belize. So overall, it was presented as a solution meal. So this example, you couldn't have two bigger contrasts. As far as food goes and the dining environment and so forth before and after colonizations. Yeah.
I was just going to say, when I was growing up in Nashville, Princess Diana came through and ate at the Loveless Cafe, which is like famous for biscuits and gravy.
Yeah.
And she ordered a banana, and it was like an uproar in the newspapers and all the news. Like, how dare she come through Nashville and eat the infamous Loveless and order a banana? I mean, it went on and on.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's a scandal, isn't it? Yeah, because why is that? Because it's so tied to identity. If you're from this place, this is the kind of thing we make and that we eat, and that this is what we have for special occasions, this is what we have for everyday food. And so it's all of these distinctions of class and social group and ethnicity, as well as, sort of territory, location. And so Pierre Bourdieu is a sociologist who did a very famous study of taste and looked at all those different issues. And people have since gone back and sort of retested that. And Richard Welk did the same thing in Belize after all these different experiences, and took these personal histories and really got at what food was, how it was playing into these issues of taste, and how different, were the foods that people were consuming across different social groups. And that what he found was that it was mostly age that distinguished different. Even though you have all of this ethnic variability in Belize, it wasn't strongly different by those groups. It was mostly age that was the main. And so he found it to be a less hierarchical sort of society than what Bourdieu found for France when he did this study. And less differences in terms after independence, less differences in the foods that were being consumed between poor people versus wealthy people. That there was this sense of national identity that emerged that really united people across different classes by food. Now, so that study really emphasized particular food items like the gibnut or kinds of stews. And what we tasted with the chocolate is flavors and techniques going into that give it different tastes, right? So the different companies have different tastes to them, even though the cacao is coming from generally the same place. Terroir, so it looks like terror, but it's a French term that refers to geography and also to the people doing the producing as well. And I talked about this before in here, didn't I, with wine? You can plant wine, the same kind of grape in different places, and depending on the climate and the way that people tend the grape itself, it'll result in different sorts of tastes in the wine. Well, you can have that in lots of different foods. Cheese, so we've seen it in chocolate. There's also cheese. Honey. Across the board. And this is a food. Have any of y'all heard of lardo? Okay. This will be a treat. Have you been to the Davis Mansion? How many people have? Yeah, I know he has. I made it good. There's a mantle in the formal parlor. So when you walk in a mansion, on the left-hand side, this is the formal room with the more formal furniture and this gleaming white mantle of marble, and it's Carrara marble. It's the same marble that Michelangelo used to sculpt David. So it's valued because it's of its color, and it's got this sort of translucent look to it, gleaming. So this Carrara has been mined for centuries because of the unique qualities of this marble. And you see how it's sort of this very pale color with these little veins running through it of sort of grayish, slightly different. Well, the people who work in the marble mine developed a food that was, these are working people, not necessarily particularly wealthy, but of that region. And developed a food that has since become really kind of famous in different ways. This thing called lardo, what does that look like? Yeah, it looks like the marble, doesn't it, right? But what would you identify it as?
It looks like fish.
fish.
I was gonna say fat.
Uh-huh.
It's like prosciutto.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's basically what it is hog fat. So it's like bacon, like it's like a portion of bacon, but with very little meat in it. You know, you can see a little bit there.
Oh, wait, so the white part?
Yeah, it's the fat. Yeah, exactly.
It's like the opposite of meat. It's like there's like, is the red part meat?
Yeah.
It's like the opposite of like the meat we eat. There's like little strips of fat in it, and then the rest is like the majority is meat. It's like the opposite.
Right. In fact, we have on our bacon packages those little windows so you can look and make sure you're not getting a bum batch that's mostly. Well, here, so what is that telling you? We're worried about the fat. The fat we consider lower quality, right? That's not the goal. We want meat. We're meat eaters. This is, and it's a food of poverty, just like the local shellfish and fish were foods of poverty in Belize because they were abundant. Well, here, you know, even the rest of the pig is sort of highly valued, and this is, you know, they're making it into another food. And do you have a guess what this is on that? Yeah, some spices. So basically, the process, and you'd eat it like this. So in these really super thin slices, and imagine it, a really thin slice of cured fat like that on a piece of bread with some onion or a tomato or something like that, and you've got a meal, basically. As far as in terms of calories, you know, that's going to sustain you. And so what they do, you know, these are marble workers. So they have these marble vats that are in people's basements. So it's cool, and you put the pig fat in there and layer different herbs and spices on there and salt, and you leave it for months because it takes a long time for it to cure. And so when you open it, you know, you may have a good batch, you may not, but usually most people, you know, and again in this study, this is something that's gone on for generations and generations, and so people in this area have this tradition of curing the pig fat this way. It's covered with rock salt and all these different herbs and things. And then you add, a little bit of bacon on top, like to starter it in a way. 6 to 9 months. And then what emerges from that is that very finely cured fat. Here's an example of what it looks like in the marble thing. So the way that people would talk about it is that, like, it's very refreshing, you know, that it in fact was like for a working person's meal, like you're going out, and especially farm workers, people working in the mines, saw it as sort of this quenching, very sustaining sort of food. And then what do you think happens? This has been going on for hundreds of years. What's happened in Europe lately that would have something to say about these practices? The EU, forming the EU. And so part of that too is establishing food standards and food guidelines that reach in and across these communities. And so there were restaurants like this. Evidently in Kolanata, this is particularly a famous place to go and eat lardo. But when the EU, you know, when they were starting to implement some of these regulations, okay, what did I tell you about how it's produced? In somebody's basement, unregulated, in these stone vats. You know, they're like, no, this is no way. You can't. They shut down the restaurant. They forbade sales of it. because they saw it as potentially, a health hazard. And what do you think the local people's responses were? Huh? Yeah, exactly, right. Are you nuts? This has been our food for generations, and you're telling us it's no good. And so there was this huge backlash, and sort of, we've had a more recent example with the Brexit and Great Britain, where people feel like there was too much intrusion into people's daily lives by the EU, and this was like an earlier, smaller scale version of that. It's like, get your hands out of my lardo. And it brought up all these other sorts of things about how much should the EU be regulating eating habits, and ideas of good eating and enjoyment of food, and that these foods, and there were other examples that came into play in different regions of Italy, these foods are our identity. They're so linked to this place and so linked to our community and the way we've grown up and the way we've eaten, that it really should be dealt with in a different way by these political organizations. And it also was taken up as this example by this sort of political food movement called the slow food movement, which is exactly in response to fast food. So, and this is across, this is an international sort of movement where they argue that, too much of industrial food production that we've been talking about is about this quick consumption of low quality food that we don't even know where it comes from. And the idea with slow food is that we reintegrate enjoyment of food, high quality food, and things that are local. Good, clean, and fair. So Lardo was one of those examples within this movement of slow food, local production that can lead to high enjoyment. And then the thing that happens with Lardo in particular, if you go to a fancy restaurant in Chicago, you're likely to find it because it's become this gourmet item. So very fancy retailers will sell it, and you see it again. Yeah, look at that. Like this, it looks like cheese or something, and it's served in these really thin slices like that.
The texture of it, like, I imagine it being like really chewy.
It's like butter. Yeah, it's so thin that when you bite it, it is. It's like butter. Yeah.
Like butter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do they eat with it? Or?
You can. Like, I've seen it in some. There was a restaurant in Asheville that had it, and so you'd have like a toast kind of thing, and some other. Sometimes like prosciutto or something like that, and then the lardo over the top. And it's sort of like, it's just super thin, and then you bite it, it's not chewy. If you did a big hunk of it, yeah, it'd be chewy. But it's usually served like that. So it ends up in these really, so then it becomes a fight as it gets taken up by these high cuisine sort of people, and the trade in it gets intense about, well, we should have a designation, a single origin terroir designation, that you can't call it lardo unless it's from Colonnata, because we're the ones who've been producing it. And you have all these fake lardos springing up in different places and trying to get the same price that really we should be getting for our stuff. And so it brings into play, ideas of regulation and evaluation of quality and those kind of standards, and that idea of terroir, that if it's made, it doesn't have to be made in that one place by those people for it to be the right thing, for it to be authentic. Have you seen that with, I think it's more common like in cheese? local French cheeses and things that are called something slightly different because they're not exactly, and Italian cheeses. Okay. So it's these ideas of how regulation and experience of food and how it's being produced, and then ideas of cultural preservation all coming together with some of these different slow foods. Okay, and then finally the Costa Rican example gets into, again, this idea of authenticity. It's not terroir exactly that the particular chapter is talking about, but ideas of the place and the people, and particularly methods that really designate, are essential to the identity of the people. And they bring Bourdieu in again with his idea of habitus. And habitus is just conscious and unconscious how you do stuff, the environment that you're in. And so it can be habits in that sense. And this particular reading talked about and preparing these different local Afro-Caribbean foods. It's your hand. So have you, any of you sort of cooked with a family member or a friend or something, and they don't use, or at least for some recipes, they don't use a cookbook, they just know it. And you're trying to follow along, and how do you know that tastes right? Or how do you know this is, and it's just like magic or something? Yeah. Well, it's that kind of idea, especially in this case where you have a population, it's dealing with the people who live in this community, the city of Limon in Costa Rica, and they're Afro-descendants. And so they have a distinct cuisine that comes from that, and the way they use local foods, the way they prepare it more than anything else. And so there's this issue of, it's very central to identity in the sense of they just know how to make these things. You know, the people who are seen as like authentic. Yeah, I don't want to use that, but typical and legitimate in some ways are the ones who, you know, they just know how to make these different foods. And yet at the same time, there's been this huge boom in tourism out that way. For some of the same reasons that Belize has had this, been very attractive for tourism. So it's ecotourism as well as getting into these what are thought of as exotic cultures. So I think this particular reading gives a good example of they are showing this exoticism in a way that the tourists expect. So it's not they're just opening the door to their house and serving the food that they necessarily have every day, but they're producing particular foods that tourists have come to think about. And one of them is this rondon that is literally run down, which means you're super tired and you can't go off and buy a whole bunch of stuff. And so the idea is you use whatever's at hand and you make a stew that's based in coconut milk. So it'd be like sort of like stone soup. Have y'all heard that? Folktale. So, you know, this delicious stew, and how do you make it? Well, you gotta put this and this and this and this, whatever. And it's not the stone at all. It's the kind of quirky assemblage of different ingredients and the manner of preparing it. But the problem is now, with all the tourism, a lot of those foods are actually, and also with legislation that's happened in Costa Rica about local foraging. So it used to be wild foods would go into Rondon. Now you have to buy them. So it's sort of like that meal that Richard Wilk had in the 70s, where this is actually very expensive to produce. It's not the cheap food of poverty that it once was, but it's made for tourists so that they can enjoy it. And then there's some other typical foods from the region, like this bread that has all these different mix of ingredients. And again, it's that idea of those people who grew up, they don't even necessarily think consciously about it. They just know how to do it, and it's part of their regular practice. Okay, so those are the 3 different examples that you can contrast, sort of like we had different Peruvian examples of chocolate to contrast. But all of them have this interweaving of political change, political influence, and local habits, and then sort of international and local consequences of that. So, have fun. We'll see you Thursday.
Honestly, this is